Hello, this is Phil Sutcliffe, and I'm the old journalist on Sounds who interviewed Gentle Giant back in May 1976 for their interview album. I was just doing a feature for Sounds, but I ended up also doing the interview with Gentle Giant, which went on the album in between the tracks. Anyway, Kirk Heron asked me to record this feature for you all, so I'm very glad to do that. I'm attempting to do that, and we'll see what occurs. I'll go right to the feature now, and I'll read you the intro that the sub-editor put on it first. And what he wrote was, "Well, we've had the wheel, sliced bread, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and now Big Phil Sutcliffe's copped the newie. Yep, it's Gentle Giant's 8th album." Mr. Schulman relaxes happy in the knowledge that his new record will keep a certain sounds writer drooling ecstatically for months to come. I'm not quite sure why. This is me speaking again now. I'm not quite sure why Mr. Schulman was in the singular there. I was speaking to Ray when the interview starts, so that may be it. And the setup for the feature was that I would go at 3 different stages of their recording of the album. I would go to the studio and hang around and observe them and talk to them. So here we go into the feature. Phase 1, Day 3. Ray Schulman said, "This will sound nothing at all like it does now." You've got to believe it. That is, unless the sound of an unaccompanied bass drum hitting every 4th beat is going to be the very next thing. A tight little sound, I suppose you could say, but somewhat lacking in melody and tonal colour. Gentle Giant had been recording for just a couple of days, and we were listening to the first roughs of their new album, Interview. The virtuoso thud, thud was Johnny Weather's contribution so far to a piece temporarily titled Reggae. A synthesizer line picked up, was joined by a plinky guitar, and began to humorously freak around the ja-ja beat. So, that's how it starts. All the multi-textured polyrhythmic beauties of Giant music launched from that plain old bass drum. And then they start building, layer on layer. Sometimes they're brickies, labourers. Sometimes they're stonemasons, craftsmen. Sometimes they're architects, artists. I wonder what the people who were around at the time when Christopher Wren was putting up St. Paul's thought of it. Seeing irregular lumps of stone and scaffolding growing, then finally the symmetrical white edifice. A strange experience. For people who don't know it, by the way, this is me just chatting. St. Paul's is a big cathedral in London with a magnificent cupola on top. That's the symmetrical white edifice of it. Back to their text. Whatever the effect of this construction job, the cause is the deadline. They have to finish recording in time for the final tape to be sent to America for mastering on March the 12th. The greatest irony is that the long piecemeal process begins with them playing the whole album, bar a couple of tracks that hadn't been written yet, and straight off, just like the Beatles and the swinging blue jeans used to. Bang! 12 tracks in a day. It's number 1. It's top of the pops. But then they pair it all away to a rhythm track or 2 and a guide guitar, as they say, for a guide guitar for the melody, which will also be deleted in the final mix. Ray, bass, violin, and 3 notes on the trumpet, said, "It would be ideal if we could record all the instruments at once, but the problem is the spill from one track to another, which would ruin the clarity and quality of the sound. So When you're overdubbing, you're aiming to get back the feel of that original, and at the same time add some touches that would be impossible in a live take. For instance, should bass, violin and trumpet be desirable simultaneously, Mr. Schulman would be in some difficulties without the techniques opened up by multi-channel mixing. You see where we are here in the 70s. This is still a novelty. Wonderful. Back to the text. Kerry Minnear, keyboards, vibes, flute, cello, sat patiently in the corner of the basement playback room in Advision Studios. He had been interrupted in the middle of writing one of the extra songs needed, working in the solitary world of his guitar, a Revox tape recorder, and his headphones. He looked a touch embarrassed when they turned to the roughs of Kerry's hit single, that's the joke working title, but he needn't have. It was no more than piano and bass, yet the trills and runs, riding a typically mobile giant rhythm, were so attractive it seemed a shame that they would never again be heard unadorned. That's what the roadies always say, said Ray. Leave it, leave it. But we see a further vision. Sure, when we started the band, we would throw in a 5/4 passage almost to be awkward, because we were supposed to be progressive. But we passed that. All our efforts now are directed at that total vision we had when we wrote the number. Kerry says, it's always wise to keep the original tape, and I don't like to go ploughing on, struggling to get it right. I prefer to put down an idea on the Revox, then leave it for a couple of weeks, maybe just playing it once or twice, and then come to it fresh and complete the song. The trouble is, that's utopia and this is business. They were able to give themselves a month to write before going into the studio this time, but they are men and not machines. Consequently, things do not go according to plan. Ray said, with the rueful smile of the cat who smelt the cream, whenever we start writing, we have to go through 2 weeks of blankness, just sitting there, like this. He slumps like a stringless puppet to illustrate the point. The whole bit. Oh, I'm washed up. I'll never write another song. All that. Brother Derek, vocal sax, said, I seriously think that if we were given a whole year to make an album, we'd take an 11-month holiday, then start. That was the talk. The work had to be done. And we went back up to the studio. Guitarist Gary Green installed himself to record a tough overdub, a jolting run, springing across the main riff of a number that was already quite well advanced. Eventually, it became I Lost My Head. He stood among the miscellaneous array of mellotrons, organs, amps and screens, like an alien life form in a British Museum display case. His mouth moved like a fish in a tank, and his words barely made it through the intercom. Major Tom to ground control. On the other side of the control room window, Gentle Giant took up the postures which were to become familiar to me over the next month. Ray, smiling, calm, persistent, sitting at the desk to the left of the young staff engineer, Paul Northfield, 20, baby-faced, eager. Derek, robust, full of ideas, to his left, lay back in a swivel chair, usually with his feet up, but all attention. John Weathers, wry Welshman, leaning over the back of the desk, looking down on the flying hands of Paul and Ray. Kerry, quiet, constructive, standing behind Ray or sitting at the back, generally with a slightly worried furrow on his brow. The whole band together. Gary rehearsed the lick, made his own critical comments at first. You could see it was basically a good idea, with the broken rhythm of a Joe Frazier combination, but the timing was contrived to defy man or metronome. Joe Frazier, there's another contemporary reference for boxing fans. Remember him? Likely you don't. Tremendous fighter in the 60s and 70s, fought Muhammad Ali 3 times, I believe, beat him once. Anyway, back to the studio. Gary tried again, looked at the control room. Very average that, said Ray, and Gary gave him a cheery 2 fingers and tried again. Ray, it's terribly difficult for us to express what we mean about music, even to one another. I say, Gary, can you give us more, less, I suppose the balance is, I say, that's not quite right. And Derek says, that's wrong. Derek, it's a real slog doing the groundwork, building the foundations like this. The nicest part is just before we mix, when we're thinking about the last effects and putting it all together. That's the painting and decorating that makes the house look good. Gary got it right. Someone mentioned food, and they ordered another round of tea instead. It arrived, thick and bitter, though it wasn't from a machine. They said Paul had been the assistant, which means glorified tea boy, on the last album, Freehand. They reckon he got promoted to engineer because he made such a rotten cuppa. It's quite rare for every member of a band to sit in throughout recording. In particular, as a breed, drummers tend to lay down the beat, then piss off to more alluring pastimes like booze. Bald but sexy, Mr. Weathers explained his presence thus. I'm a nasty bastard. Little did I know it, but opportunity was about to knock for Phil Sutcliffe. Derek took advantage of this lull in the shooting to say, Phil, you wouldn't like to interview us, would you? But I thought that's what I was. Oh, for the album. Interview. For some possible between-track links, I see. Act like a dumb reporter and ask silly questions. A piece of cake. My guts immediately clenched up with nerves, and yet the funny thing was that as soon as we sat round the mic, imagining ourselves in a hick local radio station for our improvised nonsenses, they became the tongue-tied, giggling amateurs, and me the silver-tongued old pro patter merchant. We struggled on for about 10 minutes and laughed our socks off. I ended up glowing and wondering whether I'd been discovered at last. We'll see. More tea. It was going on midnight. Gary went back in to play an acoustic part and expressed displeasure with his Hagstrom guitar. Ray, that sounds like a bad guitar. Gary, it is. Johnny, try it without the capo. Ray, yes, it's got plenty of middle and bottom after all. Gary, just no bleeding top. I went off to bed. Gentle Giant worked on. Phase 2, Day 12. It was about 10 p.m. when I went to Advision. Gentle Giant, through that door, said the night porter. I'd had no sleep that night because of a partly cocked-up trip to Edinburgh to see Focus, so events were passing by as in another world, a kind of audio-visual echo chamber. I went into the studio, and the hellos were drowned out by a high-octane backing track, an orchestra of guitars and keyboards with that distinctive Gentle Giant movement, powerful and surprising in its jaguar leaps and pauses. And, stone me, there was that Gary Green piece of leapfrog guitar, shaking my nerves and rattling my brain. I lost my head. Mark II. The track was nearly complete, as were many others, and yet the strange thing was that the latest roughs were far more frustrating than the basic rhythm tracks. Now the music ached for vocals. That's a real sense of structure when an absent component shouts out its necessity. The cupola on the cathedral? Okay, that's too grand. But it did show that all their instrumental elaboration has design, purpose. It's not just mind games leading nowhere. Their sloth in the writing department had continued. The eighth and final track was still just a glint in Kerry's eye, but they weren't unduly worried. Ray said, "It's okay. It'll be completed soon after release." Derek said, "We'll be doing overdubs in the record shops." This time, they were even content enough to eat and went round to the pub for sausage sandwiches and a game on the computer table tennis, which they roped in to open side 2 of freehand, setting up the near random dynamic rhythm of Time to Kill. Over halves of various ales, they talked longingly of putting an album together in a much looser way, a track here, a track there, open to inspiration and the right ambience. Record, then out onto a Jamaican beach to refresh the spirit and sensitivity before a critical reappraisal. Dreaming? Well, maybe a band like Gentle Giant on their 8th album, low profile at home, yet established internationally, can make such deluxe brochure ideas come true. Or maybe it's just winter longings and halfway studio claustrophobia. 2 weeks gone, 2 to come within those walls, 18 by 12, at least 6 people, and the huge mixing panel, empty coffee cups. Tonight, empty wine bottles too. Within those walls, the scene was unvarying, yet the emotional ebb and flow, impetus of their creation, was so different for each member. Johnny hadn't played anything for days and would only have a day's work on the so far unwritten track to come, while Derek had made his first contribution only that day with a sax part. Anyway, dreaming is what the pub round the corner is for, a sound balance. Wandering back, Ray made some quick calculations on the cost of studio time and said, "That's about £100 those beers cost us. That's so brazen." He sounded shocked and smiled brazenly. You have to relate that £100 to current prices, I should add. Imagine that. So that would be 46 years on. That £100, well, Lord knows what it would be now. Back to the text. They slipped into their habitual positions around the control room, with Kerry and Gary sitting at the back in front of a portable synthesizer, Kerry to play, Gary as a kind of auxiliary knob twiddler. Kerry settled down to repeat and vary melody and shape, hitting switches and buttons, trying it against the track, discussing whether they wanted it up front or as a richener, repeating and varying. The others waited, chatted, offered suggestions, laid back off him. The surprising impression was that finding the desired tone from a synthesizer is still a fairly hit-or-miss procedure. Kerry decided he was ready for a take, and suddenly was hitting the same notes, but as far as Jerry Lee Lewis, until a bum note stalled him. And again. "Sorry, spotted the old sweaty finger routine." He fell into a glut of mistakes, slapped his own wrist, easing any tension by self-criticism, but nobody was showing a trace of impatience, only concern. He repeated. "Are we keeping you awake, Phil?" said Gary, and I realised I'd fallen asleep in my chair. An hour had passed. Kerry had just done a reasonable take at about the 30th attempt. They listened to the playback. It wasn't right. They deleted it, agreed to leave it for now and move on to something else. I moved on to home and bed. Phase 3. Day 26 to 27. Overnight, that is. They were 6 days late finishing, but this had to be it. The stereo tape of the album had to be on a plane to the States the following day. Everyone was tired, but almost bathing in fatigue, luxuriating in it. "We didn't finish work until 8 this morning," said Derek, the way a war veteran might brandish a campaign medal under your nose. I got back to the hotel room. Suddenly it was all too much, deciding whether to take my shirt or my shoes off first. It was about 9 at night now, and they were in Air Studios off Oxford Street, temporarily, because, overrunning, they had to snatch studio hours wherever they could. Down the corridor, Wings at the Speed of Sound was just being completed. Gentle Giant were just into the very last moments of actual recording. Gary stood by the tape machine, running part of a GG special glorious English harmony vocal number back and forth, while Kerry rehearsed Ray in the last line to be overdubbed. John told me it used to be called The Slow One, but now it's Empty City. My scalp was tingling with the wordless emotion of watching a moment of beauty being created. The intent, yet peaceful expressions on the faces of Kerry and Ray as they sang it over and over, eyeball to eyeball. I was wondering about comparisons with being present at a childbirth, when Ray suddenly cracked out screaming, "It's so sad, so sad! Why did she leave home?" and collapsed in a heap of mock sobbing. John said, with the relish of his round Welsh vowels, "It'll be all right when we get the blues guitar on." They decided to record. Once again into the unbeautiful side of recording. Endless repetitions caused by endless imperfections. Pain, patience. Ray stood in the booth at the back of the room, headphone on, tried the very hard, high, but not falsetto line. "Derek, can you get the diction a bit better?" Ray, "Try." Again. Kerry, "That was close. The first part especially." Wrinkle of the nose. "Not worth keeping, though." Again. Gary, "You're singing Return pretty consistently flat." Ray, "I'll pull my trousers up tighter." Again. Kerry, "The first part was pretty good. We'll keep that and drop you in." Again. Derek, "It was sharp." Ray, "Me? No." Kerry, "He was flat." Derek, "All right, he was sharp and flat." Again. Derek, "That should be okay when we double track it." It was. Derek, "That's it." Ray, "Don't play it back to me. I hate my voice." Time to walk round, yes, no limos, to Advision for the final mixing, which they expected to take all night. Derek, in his ebullient way, that still seems to burst through a little shy uncertainty, told everyone, "It's the best yet. I really feel that. I'm going to play it next week and say, yeah, I know it." They decided on a half hour in the pub before finally surrendering to the hours, and I did a proper interview with them to find out how things had felt between my occasional glimpses. Right, it's been the hardest. We didn't want to let anything slip. If anything might be wrong, we wouldn't let it pass. We were getting paranoid. We played one mix on every conceivable piece of equipment in the building, and then got Paul, the engineer, to bring his own hi-fi in as a last check that it would sound good in people's homes. And they were all still together in the fullest sense of the word. Ray, "We have never had more involvement than now. John and Gary have been along to every session, which hasn't happened before. Though, of course, there's always an element of looking after your own bit. Hey, you're going to lose my bass completely," or whatever. In a way, you never trust anyone else. Was their patience with one another always as perfectly Job-like as when under a reporter's eyes? Kerry, "Yes, if you feel things are going a bit funny, you walk out for a while." Derek, "When I know I'm going to be detrimental to the atmosphere, I go away and then come back to see what's been done." Kerry, "It's actually good to have people drifting in and out because Someone's always getting a fresh first impression. Ray, recording is such a laborious process. If it wasn't our band, I just couldn't be there. I couldn't stand it. Back to our vision, with maybe that slow stirring of adrenaline in the blood that a marathon runner calls on for a special but sustained effort. And immediately Gary discovered that his car has been towed away, and Paul found that one of the tape machines wasn't working. "Rats," he said, as always, in times of stress. He had to call up the chief engineer for instructions on how to fix it, which resulted in the following scene. Paul with his tools at the tape deck, while Ray, doing liaison at the phone, said things like, "He's sticking it in and he's screwing it." Paul screwed successfully, and they began a long sequence of final adjustments. A track called "Timing" erupted from the speakers in their familiar broken tunes, surging, hanging, jolting you back down onto the guitar line. In such a concentrated situation, I heard the details of their rich sound when I'd just been enjoying the overall effect before. Meaty organ and sax riffs, counterpointing violin with the peak of excitement coming from a vocal that was like stepping off the top of a mountain, a free fall. Its melody was not mirrored by any of the instruments, could not have been anticipated, and yet it worked. A dramatic musical coup. Derek: I wrote it, but it was really difficult. I just shut my eyes, gritted my teeth, and hoped for the best. I felt really edgy about it. They separated out the bass on pre-fade listen, and there was a bum note which brought smiles and grimaces to every face, though I didn't even hear it. The dreaded PFL, said Kerry. Pre-fade listen. It shows up every mistake. Too late. It stayed. Give your friends hours of harmless fun trying to spot it. Nature called, and on the way to the bog I was astonished to find the night doorman tootling away on a melodica. That's like a kazoo with a keyboard. Seemingly he's a retired trumpeter who whiles away the nights working out in arrangements for his daughter's band. That was nice. Pan's pipes feeling of music all around. Back in the basement, they were taping the elusive 8th track, in quad, the one that had kept them up till breakfast time. Kerry's percussion number, or officially, Design is what it was called. Once more, your reporter found himself devastated. It's solely percussion and choral vocals, that quality of Englishness they carry into most of their songs, driven out by an eerie sense of savagery, wildness. The feeling amongst them hearing it again was almost that they knew not what they had done, except that it was mighty powerful. 2 a.m. Looked at my watch for the first time. The hours were starting to pass like mileposts to that marathon man. The Advision management sent in a crate of assorted Bacardi, gin, whiskey, sherry, with a note thanking them for being such nice people. Someone says, and reading between the lines it says, "Come and spend your money here again soon." They were pleased, and they stuck to the lagers from the pub and more tea. 2:30, The Riff Part 2, or I lost my head. That very first number I heard Gary dubbing on a guitar part for got its final touching up. Ray and Paul separated out John's drums, solidly Ringoing away, and raised him, then did the same for bass because, as Paul said, speaking technically, it was lacking oomph. Then they silvered some echo off the vocal, which sounded sensational, unaccompanied, soaring and plunging, aggressive as a Spitfire with the enemy in its sights. The playback brought grins all round. Gary appreciating a Derek high note with a thumbs up, and Derek burying his head in his hands at the memory. 3:30. Paul was cutting some tape off a spool and jesting about how one of Eddie Offord's assistants once did that to the master of an album and was told to edit it back again when they discovered that one of the tracks was missing from their master. I should mention Eddie Offord was a famous producer of the day. I think he worked on Yes's albums quite a lot. I may be misremembering. Anyway, the text. Paul, said Derek, slowly, rather as Frankenstein would have if his butler had mislaid a vital organ. That is, if his butler's name was Paul, I mean. It was getting late. Or early. Rats, said Paul. But they found it. On another spool. 4:30. Ray and Paul were alone, making a quad tape and a backing track. At one part they knew it would be impossible to play live. 5:30. Kerry was realising that there were no vibes, cello, flute or recorders on the album. Ray said, maybe it's rock and roll. He said, sod this mixing for a lot. I think I'll have a kip. And didn't. They rolled Empty City and highlighted a piece of orgasmic fusion between sax and violin. 6 a.m. Gary's lady, Judy, who comes from quite near a town called Normal, Illinois, and whom I'd neglected to mention, was huddled up asleep on the sofa at the back of the studio amid a pile of coats, cans, bottles, plastic cups, reeking ashtrays. But what did the debris matter when you could have soul food at 6? The studio assistant, is this in his contract, brought rolls and cheese, champagne and caviar, has never been greeted so rapturously. Derek said to nobody in particular, I told that old dear in the cafe that what we were doing, and she said, oh, so you don't work at all? 7. The music was finished. Derek, shattered, anticlimaxed. I hate music. I know that now. I'd be loath to edit in the interview now, wouldn't you? I thought, hey, you're going to lose my bit completely. Ray, smiling, buoyant, fresh as tomorrow. No, let's get it done, tie it all up. Kerry, yeah. Derek, smiling, buoyant, fresh as, Okay, we'll do it. 7:30. Judy had gone back to the hotel. Somebody farted loudly on behalf of all of us who had restrained ourselves for the past 12 hours. 8 a.m. For a few minutes, Giant were all out of the studio, and I asked Paul what they'd been like to work with. He said, they're the most concentrated band I've ever worked with. They spend so much time overdubbing, but it's all part of their music. No fucking about. Do you know, Kerry's ear is so good, he sussed out a design fault in a vari-speed machine here last year. It's used to raise or lower notes where the singer can't go. Well, he found that dropping in slowed it and upset his perfect pitch. 9 a.m. Derek was singing Scaffolds, Thank You Very Much, as they worked on. He paused and said, I seem to recall that the B-side was called Long Brown Sausage. 10. It was over. They listened to the playback while I took the accompanying pictures with Gary's camera. The faces were tense. I mean, they knew it was good after all that work, didn't they? Once in a while, smiles flickered. Gary got into a riff with Upturned Thumb. Gary got into a riff with Upturned Thumb waving in rhythm. And that was it. You've worked your balls off for a month, pulled that power and beauty out of your head. Really, what can you talk about but the time of the next train back home to Portsmouth? I said, it was really good. Thanks a lot. Good luck. And got a tube to the office to start the day's work. That's the end, folks. Just recording in my office here in Streatham Hill, South London. And apologies for the odd plane going over, train passing by, my wife popping in and shutting the door and opening the door. Anyway, I'll hope that's usable, hope it's comprehensible, and you enjoy it. And anyway, keep on enjoying Gentle Giant and all the rest, all the music you love, eh? You can't knock it, you gotta love it. Bye-bye for now.